but that is to let you know that we are recording. So I can now formally give you a very, very warm welcome from London, where the weather is kind of average, as it normally is, not too hot, not too cold, a little bit overcast. I am Shirley Gilbert. I am Professor of Modern Jewish History at UCL. I'm also the Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established in memory of the late British historian. Sir Martin was, of course, the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill. He also wrote many dozens of books, as you will all know, on 20th century history, including the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, the history of Israel, the history of the modern Jewish experience. He was really a towering historian of the 20th century. And working for the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre over the past couple of years, it's been really clear to me the enormous esteem in which he was held by his audiences, and those audiences were really extensive and loyal. Sir Martin had a particular gift for bringing history alive to his audiences, and so our aim at the Centre, in keeping with that legacy, is to bring the finest historical research to a broad non-academic audience, to make historical research accessible and engaging. So please do check out our program if you haven't done so already. We hold a wide program of events across the year on a range of subjects. When I finish with my introduction, I will put a link in the chat. If you'd like to join our mailing list, please do so that we can let you know about forthcoming events. And we have a really exciting program planned for next academic year. For tonight's talk, I'm especially delighted to welcome Lady Esther Gilbert, who is Sir Martin's widow and who founded the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre together with Sir Harry Solomon, who is also here with us tonight, our chair of trustees and also a close friend of Martin's. Esther originally met Martin through his writing on the Holocaust, and as you'll gather from tonight's talk, the Holocaust is also a special interest of hers. From 2000 to 2007, she created the Holocaust Memoir Digest, 3 volumes of which were published by Valentine Mitchell, and she's also written and taught an introductory course on the Holocaust for university students. Esther will be telling you much more about herself and about Martin, so I won't say too much more. But I will say that since Martin became ill in 2012, Esther has worked tirelessly to keep his work in print and to keep his legacy alive. She redesigned his website and she writes fantastic monthly e-newsletters that focus on his work and approach. So I will also pop that link in the chat, and you can go to her website to subscribe to her newsletter and also to contact her directly if you would like to do that. So Esther will speak for around about 50 minutes. After that, we'll open up the floor for your questions and comments. And in the interest of time, as we're a large group, I would ask you to post your questions in the chat, either to everyone or you can just send them to me privately. So we look forward to receiving those. And otherwise, without any further ado, I will hand you over to Esther for her talk titled Where History Meets Geography, Travels with an Historian. Welcome, Esther.
Thank you, Shirley. The one thing I think we've all missed in the last year was, if not traveling itself, then even the possibility of travel. So I'd like to take you on a whirlwind tour of places that had special importance for Martin and for me. Martin's first love, in fact, was geography. His masters at school felt that geography wasn't a proper study, so they advised him to read history. But geography always played an important role in his work, not only through his many historical atlases and maps. He believed it was important to stand at the place where history had happened, and equally to understand the history of any particular place. One of his dreams was to write an atlas encyclopedia of Jewish history. He did a series of talks on the A to Z of Jewish history, speaking about places he had visited, moving through the alphabet and around the world. This carries on from that, the places and what Martin and I learned there. In September 2000, Martin was invited to speak at an International Churchill Society gathering in Anchorage. He also spoke at Beth Shalom, which bills itself as the largest Jewish congregation in Alaska, which at that time had about 200 families. They called themselves the Frozen Chosen, and in fact, their website is frozenchosen.org. This photo was taken in the winter, not the summer. Alaska comes into the pre-war Jewish story. In November 1938, after Kristallnacht, the November pogrom that destroyed synagogues, Jewish businesses, and homes throughout Germany, there was a proposal to allow Jews hoping to flee to resettle in Alaska. You'll remember that at that time, Alaska was a territory, was not subject to the strict American quota system of the other 48 states. Sadly, the plan never caught on. It was vetoed by President Roosevelt. He worried that the sheer number of asylum seekers would be overwhelming. The State Department worried that their immigration quota system would break down if there were non-quota refugees allowed in. And some local Alaskan communities thought these would-be immigrants were unsuitable and misfits and would become a burden on the territory. It's one of the lesser well-known what-ifs of history. For B, we travel now to Hungary. In January 2001, Martin and I were in Budapest for a week. This map is the result of our tourist sites. In March 1944, Germany occupied Hungary, and by May, during the holiday of Passover, Jews from the Hungarian provinces were systematically deported to Auschwitz, organized by the Germans and carried out by Hungarian gendarmes. For most of the Jews, it was to their deaths. The story of Budapest from June 1944 to January 1945, when Budapest was liberated, shows that where there is a will, there is often a way. In his book, The Righteous, Martin describes how foreign diplomats representing neutral countries distributed passports to keep the Jews of Budapest safe from deportation. By July, the deportations had stopped, and efforts were made to protect the Jews of Budapest, first from the Germans, and then in October from the Nazi-sympathizing Hungarian Arrow Cross. An international ghetto of safe houses was set up under the protection of the Swiss, Swedish, Spanish, and Portuguese diplomats, and those of the International Red Cross and the Vatican. Their efforts, along with many other individuals connected to schools, hospitals, and Christian organizations, saved the lives of tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews. On Martin's website, I've posted articles by him on the story of the Jews of Budapest during those dark days. My C is to the northwest. Denmark was the scene of an amazing rescue of 7,200 Danish Jews. And interestingly enough, it was through the efforts of a German. There weren't many members of the German Nazi Party who helped Jews, but among them was the German diplomat in Denmark, George Ferdinand Duckwitz. He was to be in charge of deporting the Danish Jews to their deaths. Appalled at the idea, he protested in Berlin, but to no avail. So he flew to Sweden and met with the Swedish Prime Minister, who agreed to take in the Danish Jews. In March 2009, Martin and I were part of film director Michael King's film crew of The Rescuers, Heroes of the Holocaust. We were on the trail of those diplomats, like the ones in Budapest, who would save Jews, in many cases against their government orders. Certainly this was the case of Herr Duckwitz. On October 1943, during services for the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the rabbi announced Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha is the portion of the Torah in which God tells Abraham to leave his father's home to a land that God will show him. It was the signal for the Jews to make their way to the coast, secretly, where they would be taken in fishing boats under cover of darkness to safety in Sweden. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem has honored righteous Gentiles who risked their lives to save Jews, but you will not find the name of a single Danish person on their list. Instead, it is the Danish resistance who felt theirs was a communal responsibility to rescue their countrymen and ensure their safety, and are honored as one. We now travel east to my D to Delhi. In January 2005, Martin took me to India for a honeymoon. I had to get his adopted Auntie Florrie's approval, although we were already married. We met General Jack Farge Raphael Jacob, who was a decorated hero of the Second World War and a highly respected general, the first Jewish general in the Indian Army, and a leader in the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. He became, among his other appointments, governor of Goa and Punjab. General Jacob had been born into a Jewish family whose roots were in Iraq and was part of the Baghdadi Jewish community of Calcutta, now Kolkata. He said once he was proud to be a Jew and was also an Indian through and through. He was president of the Judah Hayam Synagogue in Delhi, where Martin and I spent a Friday evening. Most of the congregation had by then gone to Israel. With his interest in history and his military background, General Jacob and Martin had many lively discussions. From India, we go to Canada, to Edmonton. Martin's first visit to Edmonton was in 1987, where he addressed the local Churchill Society. I was living there at the time and had been reading his books, but I found out only afterward that he had been there. I was quite miffed to have missed the opportunity to meet him. Well, we did meet in the end. Edmonton had been established as a trading post for the Hudson Bay Company in 1892. The first Jews, Abraham and Rebecca Crystal, arrived the following year from Bessarabia. William Diamond came a few years later, leaving his brother Jacob in Calgary to start a Jewish presence there. Diamond established a clothing business in competition with Abe Crystal, though they were able to join forces to create the Edmonton Hebrew Association, which established a Jewish cemetery, and the Hever Kadisha, the Burial Society. William Diamond donated the land for a synagogue, and in 1912, the Beth Israel was built. The first Hebrew day school in Canada, the Edmonton Talmud Torah, was founded the same year. In 1975, it became part of the Edmonton Public School Board as one of its 6 bilingual schools, and the parents only had to pay for the religious schooling. Edmonton honored Abe Crystal with a bust by Canadian sculptor Danik Mozensky, which sits alongside 3 other prominent Edmontonians. We're now back in Europe, in Germany, for Frankfurt. Martin was in Frankfurt as a young author in 1964, but this story took place 25 years earlier. Robert Smallbones was the British Consul General in Frankfurt before the Second World War. He was in London at the time of Kristallnacht, and with the approval of the Foreign Office, came up with a plan to help German Jews desperate to escape. He returned to Frankfurt and put in place what became known as the Smallbones Scheme. The United States had put a quota on Jews seeking to immigrate. A certain number of Jews were allowed in 1939, in 1940, 1941, and so on. The Smallbones Scheme allowed those Jews on the waiting list to be able to enter Britain as long as they were not planning to stay or need public funds in the meantime. Smallbones and his vice consul, Arthur Dowden, were able to get the Germans to release Jews from concentration camps with proof of a British visa. The two worked tirelessly in the 10 months before the war broke out. Tens of thousands of German Jews were saved by the Smallbones Scheme. In 2008, the then Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, unveiled a memorial plaque in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to the British diplomats who helped to rescue victims of Nazi oppression. Martin wrote a pamphlet called Beyond the Call of Duty, which you will find on the FCO website, though the name of the author is mysteriously absent. We go now southeast to my G to Italy. In Genoa, we met Miriam Krauss, the historian of the Genoa Jewish community, where there has been a Jewish presence since 5/11. In the late 1930s, German and Austrian Jews came to Genoa hoping to find refuge. Believing many of their contemporaries would come to Genoa, they built a synagogue that had 2 balconies to accommodate the number of women and children they expected. Synagogues at that time seated women and children upstairs. Rare is the synagogue with 2 balconies. The synagogue was built in 1938. The war broke out the next year. The Jews never came. After the war, Genoa was one of the ports from which Jewish survivors sailed to British Mandate Palestine and then Israel after the state was established. Miriam is one of the 3 women we will meet on our journey, whose knowledge of their community and their belief in education about the Holocaust period in particular has made a vital contribution to keeping the memory of their lost communities alive and known. My H is Andai. We see now that this unobtrusive marker is on the road between France and Spain. So that's the geography, but what's the history? Aristide de Sousa Mendes was the Portuguese consul general in Bordeaux in mid-June in 1940 as the Germans marched into France. Jewish refugees in particular fled the advancing armies and flooded through Bordeaux. Rabbi Chaim Kruger, a Polish rabbi who had come to Bordeaux with his family from Belgium, had met Sousa Mendes and asked for help. Sousa Mendes offered a visa through Portugal to Rabbi Kruger and his family. Rabbi Kruger said he would accept, but only if Sousa Mendes would do that for his entire family, every Jewish refugee coming into Bordeaux. As it happened, this was not what the Portuguese government had in mind. Sousa Mendes was under direct orders not to give visas to Jews. A few sleepless nights later, Sousa Mendes decided to follow his conscience. The number of Jews he saved is not known, but it is believed to be in the thousands. Back to our border crossing. With the Germans in hot pursuit, Sousa Mendes was in the border town of Andai and drove slowly with a group of Jews on foot up into the mountains to this crossing on the Spanish border. He knew it was so remote, there was no telephone, so the Germans couldn't call ahead and have the Spanish guards close the border. As Martin is standing, his left foot is in then German-occupied France and his right foot in neutral Spain. We now go, hopefully, east to Istanbul. Martin called Istanbul his favorite city. He hitchhiked there in 1957 before going up to Oxford. He made some money guiding tourists. He told me one English couple asked him at the end of the day if he would guide them the next day. He was the only Turkish guide they could understand. Martin and I explored the city in 2003 and visited the Neve Shalom Synagogue, the largest Sephardi synagogue in Istanbul, built by Jews descended from those who had been exiled from Spain during the Spanish Inquisition 500 years earlier. On the 6th of September 1986, during a Saturday morning Shabbat service, 2 Palestinian militants attacked the synagogue, killing 22 Jews. As a memorial, the clock is stopped at the exact moment. I was shocked to see hard hats under each seat as a protection, if needed, against future attacks. Hopefully you can see the yellow hard hats underneath each seat. In November, 5 months after our visit, there was another terrorist attack at a synagogue in Istanbul. The Neve Shalom Synagogue, whose name means Oasis of Peace, was in fact the target, but the attackers did not gain entrance, so there was no loss of life inside. I'm grateful to Yanni Azdane, who has joined us today from Istanbul. Yoni sent the photos of the Neve Shalom, which were much better than mine. Yoni was our guide on a later visit to Istanbul, and his English is much better than mine. No mention of geography and history regarding Jews would be complete without a stopover in Jerusalem, the center of Judaism for the last 3,000 years and a place holy to Christians and Muslims. Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister and former mayor of Jerusalem, said there is not one city in the world that has all the Christian denominations, 42 of them, as are in Jerusalem. In 2008, while Olmert was prime minister, he invited his British counterpart, Gordon Brown, to Israel. Brown led a delegation of business people keen to establish contacts in Israel and in the West Bank. They met with people in Tel Aviv and in Ramallah and Bethlehem. Brown was invited to address the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. It was an historic occasion, and Martin and I were fortunate to be there. In his speech, Brown said, and I quote, "I'm especially pleased as the first British Prime Minister to address the Knesset, to congratulate you at this 60th anniversary on the achievement of 1948. The centuries of exile ended, the age-long dream realized, the ancient promise redeemed, the promise that even amid suffering, you will find your way home to the fields and shorelines where your ancestors walked." That night, Olmert invited Brown to a private dinner at his residence. What gift do you bring an Israeli prime minister? What gift do you give a visiting British prime minister? Books by Martin Gilbert. We go now north to my K, to Kaunas. The story of Kaunas in 1940, known then as Kovno, involved a group of diplomats there before the German invasion of Lithuania in June 1941. Like the diplomats in Budapest, they worked together, but they didn't necessarily know each other. Like Rabbi Kruger in Bordeaux, who was able to escape thanks to Sousa Mendes, it was Pessie Levin who started the process. She approached the Dutch ambassador for the Baltics in the Latvian capital of Riga, LPJ de Decker. He stamped in her passport that a visa was not required for Curacao, Suriname, and other Dutch colonies. Although a visa was not needed, entry was at the discretion of the colonial governor. But he didn't add this to her passport. Pessie's husband, Isaac Levin, approached Jan Zwaardendijk, a businessman who handled Dutch consular affairs in Kovno. Zwaardendijk followed suit and made a stamp that said simply that a visa was not required for Curacao. With this stamp, the Levins were able to go to the Japanese consul Shion Sugihara for a transit visa through Japan. More than 2,500 Jews escaped Lithuania with Zwaardendijk Sugihara visas. About half went to free countries, half went to the international city of Shanghai. None went to Curacao. The governor of Curacao at the time revealed later he would not have let the Jews in. He admitted this when he was the Dutch ambassador to Israel. The British consul in Kovno, Sir Thomas Preston, issued 1,200 Palestine visas, some of them legal, to allow Jews into British Mandate Palestine. He is among those honored in 2008 with the plaque at the Foreign Office. We travel now south into Ukraine to Mael Lviv, formerly Lvov, a great Austro-Hungarian city with, as Martin described it, Austro-Hungarian municipal sewers. This story of Lvov takes place beneath the city, in the sewers themselves, which Martin describes in his book, The Righteous. During the Second World War, two Polish sewer workers, Leopold Socha and Stefan Werblowski, knew the sewers well. They had been thieves and had stashed their stolen property there. As the final roundup of the Jews in the Lvov ghetto was taking place in June 1943, a group of 21 Jews escaped into a basement, eventually finding themselves in the sewers. Socha found the group and took them to a subterranean hiding place. The following day, and for every day after that, until Lvov was liberated in July 1944, Socha and Werblowski brought food for the Jews hiding in the sewers. They brought them potatoes during Passover, knowing that the Jews wouldn't eat bread. Their wives took their clothes to wash. They buried Jews who had died. 10 of the Jews survived. This sewer cover, watched over by a cat, is the one from which the group of Jews emerged after 14 months in hiding. From Lviv, we travel east back to India, from I.M. to Mumbai. Martin writes in his letters to Antiphori that Jews came to India as early as 300 of the Common Era and retained elements of their Judaism as they became part of the Indian landscape, as General Jacob in Delhi described. David Sassoon was born in 1832 in Mumbai to a Baghdadi family. He funded many Jewish institutions, including the David Sassoon Library. 52 years later, his grandson, Jacob Elias Sassoon, established the Knesset Eliyahu Synagogue. Martin and I were in Mumbai in February 2005, coming by train from Delhi. We were there for a Friday night, so we went to services at the Knesset Eliyahu Synagogue. Afterwards, the rabbi, Gavriel Holzberg, invited us for dinner at his home. He was Lubavitch and had opened this Chabad and outreach house in Mumbai only 2 years earlier. We were served a lovely dinner on their rooftop terrace, meeting his wife Rivka and very briefly their little son. 3.5 years later, Martin and I watched in horror as the news came through of the terrorist attack in Mumbai, taking place in the hotel where we had stayed and moving on to the Chabad house. By the time the attack ended, 6 Jews had been killed there, including the young rabbi and his wife. Miraculously, their son was saved by his nanny, Sandra Samuel. She lives now in Jerusalem. Baby Moshe, as he is known in India, lives with his grandparents, also in Israel. The Chabad house has been rebuilt. From Mumbai, we go to New York, New York. The second largest metropolitan Jewish community after Tel Aviv now is New York City. This is a positive story with a happy ending. It's a story of activism, of peaceful protests around the world that were both inspiring and successful. And New York was the epicenter. It's the story of the worldwide Soviet Jewry movement to allow Jews in the Soviet Union the freedom to practice their religion. And if that was impossible in the Soviet Union, then to be allowed to emigrate to Israel and to countries where freedom of religion is enshrined. Martin devoted himself to the cause. He traveled to Moscow, to Leningrad, and met refuseniks, those who had been refused exit visas. He wrote innumerable articles. He wrote The Jews of Hope, titled in the belief that freedom was attainable. Those he described were resilient and strong in the face of intimidation, impoverishment, imprisonment. He wrote daily letters to his refusenik friends to let them know they were not forgotten. He spoke at rallies wherever he traveled. He lobbied government leaders to advocate on their behalf. He gave the refuseniks a human face, a voice, an identity beyond the Iron Curtain. In March 1977, Natan Sharansky was imprisoned for treason and a host of trumped-up charges. Martin set about defending Sharansky, writing his biography, and answering each of the charges against him with material that had been smuggled out of the Moscow courtroom. In 1986, Sharansky, Hero of Our Time, was published, an indictment against an inhuman system. Within a few years, the Soviet Union collapsed. Martin believed the Soviet Jewry movement had been a factor in its collapse. We are honored today to have Enid Wortman with us from Israel. She and her late husband, Stuart, were prime movers and supporters of this movement and in helping Soviet Jews become acclimated in Israel. From New York, we traveled to Britain for my O, to Oxford. In his Atlas of Jewish History, Martin included this map of the Jews of Oxford from 1090 to 1290. It was his college, of which he was an honorary fellow, Merton College, that has a special Jewish connection. In those early days, many Jews lived in Jewish-owned houses in the town for which they paid rent. There were protests against the Jews, culminating in riots, the most serious in 1244, when several Jewish houses were looted. To end the tension, the Jew Jacob went to see Walter of Merton, Bishop of Rochester and patron of one of the colleges, with an idea. Jacob offered to sell Walter of Merton the 2 stone houses that he owned next to the college buildings, where students could live. The houses were sold, the college created a quadrangle inside its front gate, and Merton became the first residential college. Because Merton students no longer had to pay rent to the Jews, tensions between town and gown declined. The Jew Jacob has a celebratory gargoyle at the entrance to Merton College. He can be seen wearing a Jewish hat. With Jacob's help, the college bought more land from Jews both to the south of London and in Basingstoke, creating a substantial endowment. In the Hebrew document preserved in the archives of the college is the land sale deed, signed by, quote, Jacob, the son of Moses of London, both on my own behalf and on behalf of my wife, Hannah. It's now back to the States for my P. To Phoenix. A few years ago, our friend Juliet Solomon was compiling a book on regrets by famous people. As a fundraiser for research into epilepsy, she asked Martin to include a piece. It happened that in 1962, Martin did a driving tour around the United States with a friend, going through most of the lower 48 states. They had been in Phoenix then, and this is what he wrote for Juliet's book. I quote, in 1962, during a prolonged trip through the United States, I reached the desert city of Phoenix. I marveled at the beauty of the desert landscape of cactus and scrub. On the far outskirts of the town, land was being offered for sale at $50 an acre. I had just received twice that amount as an advance for my first book. How I laughed at the idea of buying such a remote and dusty plot of land for all my earnings. Today, such an acre commands $1 million in the least. This is not a photo of Martin in their car. I'm sure they couldn't afford such a nice one, but it is an Arizona postcard from his 1962 visit. Phoenix is special to me because Martin and I were married there in nearby in Paradise Valley, where every marriage should start. And now for Q, we're off to South America, to Quito. One of the safe havens before the war was Ecuador, which was open to German, Austrian, and Czech Jews as long as they worked in agriculture. From working on farms, the Jews eventually emigrated to Quito and other cities where they set up businesses. 5,000 Jews came to Ecuador with the help of Ecuadorian diplomats before the war broke out. Even during the war, help came in an unlikely way. Rabbi Abraham Jacobson had fled the German invasion of Norway for Sweden in 1940, becoming the rabbi of Stockholm. He approached his friend, Dr. Manuel Antonio Munoz Borrero, for help with the Jews in transit and in concentration camps being threatened with deportation. Dr. Borrero had been the consul general for Ecuador in Sweden until 1935, and then honorary consul in 1941. Ecuador had sympathies with Nazi Germany, and they didn't want Dr. Borrero doing anything to help Jews in Europe, so they removed his diplomatic powers. Despite this, Dr. Borrero decided to help Rabbi Jacobson. Throughout the war, he supplied Rabbi Jacobson with up to 700 blank Ecuadorian official-looking passports. Rabbi Jacobson was able to get them smuggled into the hands of Jews who could use them. Jews in the camps were considered stateless. These Ecuadorian passports did not give freedom, but they did save many Jews from deportation to their deaths. The American-born sculptor Howard Takeff is creating a bust of Dr. Borrero. It is made of bronze keys to symbolize liberty. It is to be installed in the foreign ministry in Quito. My R takes us back to Europe, to Greece. Jews have lived on the island of Rhodes for 2,300 years. In July 1944, the Jews of Rhodes and the nearby island of Kos were deported by ship to the Greek mainland and then by train to Auschwitz. Turkey was neutral, and the Turkish consul in Rhodes, Selahattin Ülkümen, decided to protect not only the Turkish Jewish citizens of Rhodes, but their entire families. He was able to save 50 Jews of the 2,000-strong Jewish community. In a bombing raid, the Germans bombed the Turkish consulate, injuring Selahattin's pregnant wife. She delivered their son Mehmet and died a week later. When her mother heard the news, she committed suicide. Ülkümen raised his son Mehmet on his own. The Kahal Shalom Synagogue, built in 1575, includes a museum and in the forecourt a memorial to the Rhodes Jews who were deported. The names of each are inscribed and where they are remembered. The head of the Rhodes Jewish community is Carmen Cohen, who works tirelessly to keep the memory of the community alive and to keep the few Jewish inhabitants connected. She admitted to me that she was originally Carmen Levy, and when she married her husband, she was upgraded to becoming a Cohen. For my S, we go north to Russia, to St. Petersburg. How is Jewish history taught if being Jewish means only a stamp and an ID card? If it's not part of the education system? If the archives are closed? And yet the streets and buildings and stones each tell a story. In 1983, Martin was in St. Petersburg, then known as Leningrad. He had heard about a young historian of Jewish Leningrad who led tours of the Jewish aspects of the city, very much against government policy. Martin went on a tour with Misha Bezer, and needless to say, they became friends. 1989 saw the publication of The Jews of St. Petersburg, Excursions Through a Noble Past by Mikhail Bezer. Sometimes the story of a book's publication is as much a story as the book itself. Films of Misha's pages were smuggled out and sent to London. Michael Sherborne, who coined the term refusnik, translated the Russian. Martin did maps, an introduction, and found a publisher. It is a travel guide, a history, and it brings an earlier time to life. The postscript of the story is that Misha now lives in Jerusalem and he has joined us today. He earned a PhD in Jewish history from Hebrew University and used to commute to Moscow and St. Petersburg to teach Jewish history. How times can change. Sometimes we forget. We returned to Canada for my tea. In 1940, there was a fear that Britain would be invaded, so children were sent away from the coastal areas and in many cases even sent abroad. Martin was 3 when he traveled with an aunt and her 3 children to Canada and was fostered with a family in Toronto. He learned to read and write in Canada. It was the first home he remembered. And it was also there 50 odd years later that we met. Today is Canada Day. It celebrates the 154th year of the Confederation of Canada, when 3 colonies of Canada were united as a dominion within the British Empire. In 1982, the Canadian Constitution was patriated and Canada became sovereign as an independent country, though the Queen is still the monarch and still on the money. Another union is that of Union Station in Toronto, a National Historic Site. It is a joint venture between Canada's 2 great railway systems that connect one end of the vast country with another, Canadian National and Canadian Pacific, CN and CP. Martin told me he remembered being in Union Station as a 7-year-old on his way back to England. In 1944, he went by train to New York with a group of children coming back to Britain. Years later, when writing about Churchill, he found the information that his ship, the RMS Mauritania, which had brought American troops to Britain ahead of the D-Day landings, was traveling back to the UK empty. Churchill suggested bringing the children back then. Little did Churchill realize his future biographer was on his way home. Happy Canada Day. And now we travel to Lithuania for a difficult story. Jews have lived in Ukmergė, known in Yiddish and Russian as Vilkomir, since the late 17th century. Martin's maternal grandparents came to London from Vilkomir. In 2001, we were in Lithuania for its first annual National Day of Shame in honor of the Holocaust, and we traveled to Ukmergė. There in the forest are the mass graves of more than 10,000 Jews from Ukmergė and a few surrounding towns who had been brought to this clearing in the woods in 1941, made to undress and shot into mass graves. If this were the only such place, it would be a horrendous atrocity. The late Greville Janner, who was dedicated to Holocaust education, established a system in Lithuania where markers at the roadside pointed to nearby mass murder sites, such as this one. There were hundreds of such markers. And that is only Lithuania. Across Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, and Ukraine, in ravines and forest clearings, not far from their homes, Jews were rounded up and shot. 3,000 Einsatzgruppen, specially trained Germans, organized the killings across this vast area and were assisted in each locale by local collaborators. Knowing that neighbors in Western Europe would not be so willing to help kill the Jews in their towns, the Germans came up with another plan. They met in January 1942 at the Wannsee Villa near Berlin. The decision taken was to deport Jews from Western and Central Europe to an unknown destination somewhere in the East, to mechanized extermination centers, death camps, where they could be killed on an industrial scale in secrecy without the need for huge numbers of collaborators or the possibility of resistance. These mass graves in the Pavonia forest is one place among thousands across the region. And those are only the ones that have been located. From IV, we move next door to Vilnius, now the capital of Lithuania. As Vilna, it was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Its scholars, its yeshivot, religious academies, its religious and cultural institutions were famous and revered throughout the Jewish world. The Holocaust in Lithuania and elsewhere in the former Soviet Allied states has become a political tool, not an historical one. Desperate to distance themselves from their powerful Russian neighbor, now many disregard their collaboration with Nazi Germany and mourn those they lost under Soviet occupation. Their Holocaust history, and in Lithuania there were more than 20 battalions of Lithuanians, in the main volunteers, farmers, teachers, doctors, lawyers, and students among them, who murdered Jews. This history has been overshadowed by their Soviet history. How has this expressed itself? Revel Janner's markers along the highways, gone. The National Day of Shame, only for visiting dignitaries. Their Holocaust history, not taught. And those historians who have tried to unearth it, sidelined. The main Holocaust historian, Rachel Costanian, has devoted her life to digging out the history, writing about it, curating museum exhibits, and teaching about it. The Lithuanian government rightly welcomes interest in Sugihara, the Japanese consul in Kovno, who gave visas to Jews to escape in 1940. And yet there is a wall of silence when it comes to the history of 1941 after the German invasion. Silence. Rachel Costanian, now in her 90s, lives in Berlin, which has honored her, a non-person in her own country, a woman of valor to those who know what she has done. For W, we go west a day's journey to Warsaw. In September 2001, on our way to Vilnius, Martin and I stopped in Warsaw. It was barely a week after 9/11. Black ribbons hung from the Polish flags, and our first night there, we attended a rally of mourning in support of the United States in the rebuilt Old Town Market Square. Martin had been in Poland and in Warsaw for the first time in 1959, part of an exchange program while a student at Oxford. That trip inspired a fascination with Eastern European and its rich history, especially the Jewish story, and he was to return to Poland many times. The Germans' first plan to rid themselves of Jews was through emigration before the war. This is how the diplomats played such an important role. After the German invasion of Poland, their second plan was to segregate Jews in ghettos, where the amount of food and medicine was tightly controlled. The Warsaw Ghetto, in the city that had been the cultural heart of European Jewry, was the largest. And by the end of 1941, 4,000 Jews were dying of starvation and disease every month there. We know that in the East, death was accelerated by the Einsatzgruppen mass murder killings, which gave way in 1942 to deportations to the death camps. Warsaw's Second World War memorial depicts a railway line with a wagon of crosses and Jewish matzevot, tombstones. Martin told me during the 1980s, when Poland was desperate for independence from Soviet control, a tramway ran alongside this memorial, and the train drivers would throw flowers onto the memorial. They felt they did not fight a war to replace one totalitarian regime with another. I'm not a historian, so this next story is not definitely a fact, but it might be. It's also not necessarily a place, but it might have come into being in this place. Leo Rosten, who defined many Yiddish words that are now part of English, gives the possible etymology of another word. The first 2 decades of the 20th century saw a huge influx of Eastern European Jews fleeing pogroms and poverty, hoping to find their fortune, or at least security, in the New World. They came into the United States through Ellis Island. Illiteracy among Jews was quite rare, as many attended school at a young age to learn Hebrew prayers. Few who came to the United States as immigrants were literate in English, though. Immigrants had forms to complete, and if they couldn't sign their names in English, they were instructed to put an X in the appropriate box. Religious Jews would not make the sign of the cross, so they filled in the box with a circle instead. A circle in Yiddish, the language most of them spoke, was kaikel. A little circle is a kaikela. It didn't take long for these Jews to be recognized, and the line from kaikel to something less complimentary was short. Back to some history that has some basis in fact. Neither Martin nor I have ever been in Japan, but Japan played its story in the Holocaust. You will remember the Jews fleeing the German advance, who managed to get Svardendik Sugihara visas and route ostensibly for Curacao. They went across Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok, and because they had transit visas to Japan, they went by ship to Suruga or Kobe and overland to Yokohama. From Yokohama, those who continued on to the east sailed in Japanese vessels to Pearl Harbor, and from there to San Francisco, Los Angeles, Vancouver. During this time, the Polish ambassador in Japan, Tadeusz Romer, helped the 2,000 Jews who came through Japan with consular assistance and provided financial resources if needed. He also managed to procure visas for Jewish refugees for Palestine, the United States, and Central and South American countries. In 1941, the embassy staff were transferred to Shanghai, where the ambassador and his wife, Sophia, continued to help Jewish refugees who had come there. I've added a photo of one of these Japanese ships, the Tatuta Maru. It was the ship my mother came on to the United States from Yokohama to San Francisco in May 1941. And finally, Zaporizhzhia. My mother used to say that her town was so small it wasn't on any map. Well, in fact, this place is not even on Google Maps, though it used to be. I think it has been incorporated into the nearby town of Tomashkarad. In 2011, Martin and I were in Ukraine, in these towns and villages where my family had lived. We were on our way from Rokitno to Klesov when we came to the village of Zaporizhzhia. Martin explained there had been partisan activity there and a Jewish otriad, a partisan detachment, with a family camp of Jews living in the forest nearby. Survivors of the mass murder that had taken place in nearby Sarny and elsewhere. Just to Martin's right in the photo lay the village, so we wandered into it. There I found my favorite piece of statement art. You'll remember the Lenin statue in the city that no longer bears his name. Zaporizhzhia will always be in my heart. Thank you for accompanying me on these travels. I'm happy to try and answer questions. I know we covered a lot of ground. And Shirley, if you can unshare me, that would be good.
There we go. Thank you so much, Esther. Lots of appreciation coming from others on the screen. Thank you so much for taking us with you on your exciting travels, and also for sharing with us some of those wonderful anecdotes and postcards and photographs. Fantastic. So we have some time for questions, comments, if anybody would like to begin.
I answered everyone's questions already.
Well, actually, there is one question already in the wings. So I'm going to start with the question that is in the wings, and that is, it was in fact preempting your comment about Toronto when you got to Canada. And Elaine, who is listening from Canada, wonders whether she is correct in saying that the first time Martin encountered anti-Semitism was in Toronto when he was brought there with other children, as you explained, to protect them from the Blitz.
Elaine has been to Martin's lectures. She knows. Yes. Martin said that he learned to read and write there. The first thing he learned to read was a big banner in Toronto going across the street that said "No Jews Allowed." It was there, and it was in a store window. And it was he was a little kid and didn't understand. Although I don't know that any of us understand it yet. But yes, it was in Toronto. But I'd like to say that it's changed. And Canada is a more sane society, but every place seems to have gotten a little bit crazy now. So I don't know. I don't know.
Yes, Harry has a question. Let's see, Harry, I may need to give you permission to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Okay. Esther, when all these wonderful trips of yours, was it the same sort of drill, the same sort of program as we went through with him when we went on our roots trips? Did he have his readings with him? And did you go to the very spot where things took place so he could read exactly what had happened? And it had to be at that precise spot that the readings took place. Did it follow that pattern the same as our trips?
Harry, it was exactly the same. The only difference was he knows I'm not a morning person, so he didn't get me up at the crack of dawn.
Okay, I understand.
But he had his maps, he had notes, and each place we had to stop right there.
Yeah.
And that was it. And he did all the research beforehand. So when he got to a place, he knew what had happened.
And his timings, 11:42 we're at this place and 12:16 we're something else, the same thing. Yeah, amazing. He was an amazing man, and we've all learned so much. That was great, Esther. Really enjoyed your trip.
My daughter told a story that when he and she were in Scotland, we stopped at some place and we got out of the car, and Martin explained this battle that had gone on there. And it was amazing. And then she realized that he'd gotten it out of the guidebook 5 minutes before. But he had a way of bringing it to life.
Amazing, I know.
Which was wonderful.
Thank you. Great.
Esther, in case you're not seeing the chat, there is a lot of very positive lots of positive messages and lots of gratitude coming at you from the chat. I'll send it to you afterwards. One in particular that I just wanted to mention from Maggie Adler, who says, thanks for including my grandfather, Jose Ignacio Burbano, consul from Ecuador in Bremen, in your list of righteous diplomats. He was able to authorize visas for 40 families to travel to Ecuador, and he saved their lives. There is a question that actually it occurred to me we ought to have answered, and it was my bad that I forgot, and that is there a connection between Shirley Gilbert and Martin and Esther Gilbert? So you can answer that.
Sadly, no.
Sadly, there is no connection, and actually I keep forgetting to say this at all of our talks, that much as I share Martin's passion for history and bringing history to wide audiences, there is no connection between us. So thanks for asking that.
Well, one of the things about the diplomats, other than the ones in Budapest and the ones from Britain who were honored, most of the others, their governments weren't pleased with what they had done. And in the case of Susan Mendez, in the case of Sugihara, they lost their livelihoods, they lost their jobs. They suffered for having helped Jews. In the case of Zwardendyk in Kovno, he was afraid of what was happening when the Germans came in, so he destroyed documents. there's very little evidence. And for the Ecuadorian diplomats, there is very little evidence about what they had done, in part because in order to save themselves, and in part because they knew that they had done something that was not appreciated by their governments. So it was very courageous of them. And Yad Vashem has set up a listing of righteous diplomats. It took them time to come to that, but they realized that it's very important to honor these diplomats who helped people.
Thanks. There is a question in the chat from Eugene. I also see that Elaine wants to ask a question. Let me just convey Eugene's question. And Eugene, I have to say, you probably get the prize for having been at all of our talks this year and asked fantastic questions at all of them. So here is Eugene's question to you, Esther. He says, it's clear from your journeys around the world with Martin that all nations are capable of what we call or judge to be good and bad, yet all nations are incredibly agile when it comes to rationalizing whatever they do. For example, the Soviet Union, White Russians and Cossacks, China, the Uyghurs, Serbs, Croats, etc. Based on your visits, which country do you feel is most open to accepting the evil that men do in the context of the treatment of the Jews?
So this is a contest between those at the bottom of the barrel?
Sounds like it.
I think times change.
Yeah.
You know, we have as we go through life as countries, as individuals, we have people we're closer to and people we're not closer to, and attitudes change for one reason or another, and governments change for one reason or another, and it's hard to tell. Eastern Europe was very westward looking, and they're desperate to stay away from Russia, so they've become right wing in bouncing back and forth in against that. So I don't know, but I think as individuals, and those of us lucky to live in democracies, we have a voice, and we have to do what we can. I find it personally very sad, not sad, but it's, on one hand, people who helped Jews during the Holocaust are honored. And on the other hand, our borders are closed to people who have been in war zones for years. And there isn't a way to bring them in and integrate them into our societies. And it's a shame, because people sitting in camps, in displaced person camps or whatever, they're not growing in a healthy way. Physically, emotionally, educationally, it's very sad. So I don't have any answers other than we each have to do what we can, and use the diplomats and others who resisted as an example to stand by our morals and try and bring other people along with that. But these are difficult times. On the other hand, they've always been difficult times, so that's my consolation.
Thanks, Esther. Okay, go ahead. So it's Elaine Romanovsky whose name is showing, but I'm not sure that's actually Elaine who's about to ask the question.
It's Elaine's better half.
All right, Elaine's better half. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Where did he go?
There.
Can you hear me now, Esther?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, it's obviously it's not Elaine, Esther. It's me. But on a more amusing note, I always remember Sir Martin Gilbert, and you were talking about how involved he was with the refuseniks. And you have to understand, in South Africa, at the height of apartheid, for you to be associated with anything that had to do with the USSR or communism meant you were arrested and thrown in jail and never let out. And the South African community had invited Sir Martin to come to talk to them. And this is what he had told me. And he had a talk at the Great Garden Shul in Cape Town. and he decided to speak on the refuseniks, and forever the historian, he wanted to get his facts right, and he had phoned from Cape Town to Moscow or wherever, one of his friends who was in Russia, and I don't know how they ever got the phone call through, but he mentioned that in his speech in the synagogue, and I'm sure everyone in the congregation was horrified, as they would probably be. They thought they'd probably be arrested because they were now associated with anything related to communism. But thank God Martin wasn't arrested, and neither were all the old Jewish members of the shul. So that always amused me when you spoke about the refuseniks. So lovely talk, Esther, and Yosher Koch.
Thank you. He used to call them. He had time set up where people, refuseniks, would go to their post office and they would get a call from him. And wherever he was in the world, he called regularly and spoke to whoever was there, whoever had been set up. And at one point, he was on the line when he heard the various different operators putting the call through. And one of them, I can't remember whether it was the one in the United States or the one in Russia, who heard his voice, who heard who it was, said, "Oh, it's you, darling." So I mean, they knew him, and they knew what was going on. But he was dedicated and determined that they shouldn't be forgotten, that they shouldn't be silent.
Absolutely. But I'm sure the operator from South Africa would have been horrified at that time to be asked to put a call through to Russia. So it would have been very amusing. But
I think it went through New Jersey. I think the call went through New Jersey.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
I hope you didn't lose too much sleep over that.
No.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. And it is always especially nice to welcome a fellow South African landsman to these events. Esther, I think before I do a final thank you and wrap up, I think you wanted to say a little something about the center before we close.
Thank you, Shirley. Many of you will have taken flights where at the end of the flight, charity envelopes are passed around for whatever spare change is weighing you down. The Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center is a charity that relies on donations to continue to bring our lectures and seminars to you. Even as COVID has kept us rooted at home, Zoom has brought us together from all over the world. Please look at our website, which is soon to be updated, sirmartingilbertlearningcenter.org. Join our mailing list, and if you can, please send a donation. Happy and safe travels when we get the chance to do the real thing. And thank you again.
Thank you again, Esther, for a really wonderful talk with so many colorful and heartwarming details about your travels with Martin and all the important work that he did. This is also a reminder to look at Esther's website, www.martingilbert.com, to get her newsletters, to get in touch with her if you would like. Please do join our mailing list, as she said. I'm going to make a final plug and put it in the chat for our last upcoming short course of this academic year, and that's going to be a course on remembering the Holocaust in Britain, looking at museums and memorials, including the designs for the forthcoming memorial that's proposed for Victoria Tower Gardens. So that's starting on Sunday night, promises to be really excellent. You can find the details and book on our website. Otherwise, wishing you all a healthy and restful summer or winter, depending on where in the world you are. Keep safe. And we look forward to seeing you for our new and exciting program in the autumn. So thanks again for coming. Take care.
Thanks, Shirley.
Thank you
Thanks,
again,
Esther.
Esther.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.